In today's lecture, we're going to cover public choice theory, and it's in chapter 18 in your textbook. I really don't like how your textbook covers this chapter, so this is largely going to be drawn from outside sources, primarily um, econlib.org's basically summary of public choice theory, which I will be posting a link to in Canvas. For any questions that come on the finals about it, it will be very simple, and it will be included on the study guide, so you'll know exactly what stuff you need to read or go over in the lecture for that. So far in this course, we've talked about consumers and we talked about firms and how individuals, both like as consumers or within firms, are decision makers, how they respond to incentives, and how they act in their own self-interest as they see it. It's important to remember, and it's fairly recently that economists have discovered this and started putting this into practice in our research, that people that work in government, that they're people too. So if we look at policymakers or if we look at voters and their decision-making process, that they act within their own self-interest. And we can use the tools of economics, we can use the ideas of incentives that we've looked at so far in this course to understand decision-making within government and within voters, anything in the whole realm of politics. So whether we're talking about voters, whether we're talking about government officials, whether we're talking about people that work for the government, or interest groups that lobby the government, all of them seek to make themselves as well off as possible given the costs they're facing. So for members of government, so say for representatives, they want to increase their reelection chances. They want to do that to make themselves as well as possible. Interest groups are going to want to lobby the government to get beneficial regulations or different legislation passed that's going to help them. Those bureaucrats, people that work for the government, are going to want to try to make their career as well off as possible. So by using this public choice theory, this is a model that applies economic analysis to government decision making, and it can provide us with insight into decisions that government makes. Rather than looking at the government as one whole entity, we can see it as individuals within there, and we could see how the government or members of government come to their decision making process, how they vote on bills and decide to pass them, how they implement certain policies. James Buchanan, one of the earliest scholars in the area of public choice, called public choice politics without romance. So what we're doing is really trying to dig deep and understand the decision-making process. So rather than thinking that the participants in the political sphere, whether it's voters or whether it's the members of government themselves, instead of assuming that they're solely focused on the public good and they have a laser-like focus on that, we're not assuming that they're these benevolent public servants who faithfully carry out the will of the people, or assuming that the will of the people even exists as some coherent thing. We see them as individuals acting in these imperfect systems, just like we see individuals acting within markets, whether they're consumers or firms within the market, people working for firms. By the same token, you have people working in government, you have them being elected as representatives in government, you have people voting. And we can see how within these institutions, how they act based on the incentives that are facing them. So just like political science, with public choice, we're trying to understand how public policy comes to be adopted and what the influence of different institutions are on the political process. So with public choice theory, we're going to assume that self-interest and rational actors exist. And the goal with using public choice theory is to find an equilibrium given these consumptions. We're going to try to find out what the most likely result is when we're faced with these policy questions. So the key to public choice theory and what sets it apart from the previous theories and ideas of how government functioned is that we're going to model everyone here similarly. So every single person, whether it's voters, politicians, bureaucrats, we're going to assume that they all act within their own self-interest. They're all imperfect people, so just like people within markets, they lack perfect knowledge and they need to discover this over time, and that's an expensive process and can be time-consuming. Same type of things we saw with consumers, entrepreneurs, and managers. Now, self-interest, remember, from the very beginning of the semester, self-interest does not necessarily mean greedy or materialistic. Someone acting within their own self-interest can also take care of other people. Doesn't mean, like I said, that there's no Mother Teresa's out there, but Mother Teresa was acting within her own self-interest. She saw as the best way to live her life, something that gave her some sort of enjoyment, made her feel good, was taking care of others. So altruism is possible, but there's still the individual engaging within the altruism is making themselves better off as well. So, for instance, politicians thinking of them as vote maximizers. They're not necessarily greedy, they're not necessarily trying to maximize their income, but they're trying to maximize their votes because they're trying to get reelected into office. When we think of people in a market setting, when they're trying to make choices, what they do is they try to maximize their well-being. They look at the different alternatives they have, and they choose what's the best for themselves, considering the cost as well. So when we see public and private choice processes differ, this isn't because the motivation of the actors are different, because people, you know, making decisions within the political realm think differently than people making decisions within the market realm. If we see these differences, it's because of differences in the incentives and the constraints that are faced by people within the two different types of settings, markets and politics. So what we do as public choice scholars try to work out the consequences for things like um, for elections, the behavior of bureaucracies, the political power of different interest groups, the differences between democracies and dictatorships, the logic of collective action, and the importance of constitutions. To some of you, this may seem obvious. To others of you, this may seem like complete BS. But these ideas were developed and have grown since the 1950s and 60s. Um, James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock's The Calculus of Consent in 1962 was one of the major jumping off points, although there had been some research done prior to this. Um, Buchanan ended up winning the Nobel Prize at one point in economics for the development of public choice theory. And at the time, this was a quite radical idea. It completely changed the way that people and researchers approached their study of government and how decision making was made um, through politics. And even like to this day, it's still common for many economists and those outside of economics to put forward ideas or to work with models that would only work if government were a benevolent despot. What I mean by that is that if government all they wanted to do was maximize what we call the social welfare function, or make the country as a whole as well off as possible. Unfortunately, this isn't always the case. And we'll see this because of the different incentives that people face within their role in government. Now, I may be a little biased in talking about why you want to study public choice because I studied a lot of public choice when I was in grad school, and the research paper I did, like my master's thesis coming out of grad school, used quite a bit of public choice in my analysis. I think it's very useful, especially people looking at what's going on um, within a country trying to make decisions about politics, because politics end up becoming a large portion of our lives. So we can understand how governments function in democracies or non-democracies based on the different institutions that we have operating in each country. We can see how people are likely to make different decisions being in those different countries. We can help better understand the consequences of government behavior. So why do some countries fail to grow and get more rich? Why do other countries become much more rich? Um, why do some countries seem to have bureaucracies that work very well, very quickly and efficiently, whereas other countries we see them struggle to implement the most basic policies? We could better design constitutions. So if you wanted to design a country from scratch or wanted to improve a country, we could see what types of things are successful and what types of things are not successful. And finally, it helps us avoid the nirvana fallacy. The idea that we look at imperfect markets and we say, okay, look, markets fail here, markets fail there, markets fail here. Obviously, let's turn over to government. But there's problems with government too. So we have to weigh the realistic imperfect markets against realistic imperfect government and see which of those is more suited to the task. So let's briefly introduce the players in public choice theory. First is the voters. So the voters, obviously the people that are going to be voting in an election, these are the citizens in the country. What they do is they seek services, um, they pay taxes, and when they vote, they do so for a combination of voting in their own self-interest and voting to express emotions. One of the reasons why they're able to vote to express emotions or to express support for something or someone is the fact that one vote is very, very unlikely to change an election. Next is elected officials. So these politicians, they seek to get office and then to remain in office. They get votes from voters and they get financial support from interest groups. Next is bureaucrats. They work within the government agencies, enacting the laws and regulations that are passed by Congress. Bureaucrats seek to get larger budgets for their bureaus, for the actual, whatever department or whatever commission, whatever they work for. And as individuals, they try to get promotions and move up through the ranks within those bureaucracies. And finally, there are interest groups. These can take many different shapes. It could be firms within an industry. It can be people that are united by one cause or one idea. But what interest groups do is they're a small group of people relative to the entire country that lobby politicians to try to get laws or regulations passed in their favor. So earlier in the course, we talked about how markets can fail to live up to how good they can be in theory. That markets fall short of that perfect equilibrium, and there end up being problems with markets. So society is not as well off as possible. But remember I mentioned the nirvana fallacy, and that governments can fail in this respect too. So for instance, with externalities, markets leave off society not as well as it could be. And we can make ourselves better, we can improve it through different government policies. However, remember I said there were flaws to government too. They might not always know exactly how much of a Pigouvian tax to implement to offset that externality. So we'll explore these government failures in a little bit more detail. So there are three main ways which government can fail, and this is taken straight from the textbook. The first is rent seeking. The second is log rolling and rational ignorance. And the third is regulatory capture, and we'll look at each of these in turn. So when we talk about rent seeking, what we mean is attempts by individuals and by firms to use the government action to make themselves better off at the expense of others. So they may be seeking regulations that help them and harm their opponents and make it more difficult for competitors to enter the field and begin competing against them. It may be certain laws or certain regulations that make consumers better off or individuals living in a certain area better off. So for instance, in a lot of large cities, people living in nice neighborhoods will get some sort of zoning law passed that makes it difficult to put in apartment buildings or put in smaller homes to help increase or keep high the value of their homes. A salient example of this is U.S. sugar firms. They've, over the years, successfully lobbied for the government to place a quota on sugar imports and to keep that in place. What these sugar import quotas do is limit the amount of sugar that can be brought in from other countries. So it costs a lot less in other countries to grow sugar than it does in the United States because they have a more suitable climate. So sugar producers in the U.S. could not compete against sugar producers from other countries. But by placing a quota on the amount that can be imported into the country, what ends up happening is that the U.S. producers can end up competing because there's only a certain amount of sugar that's allowed in, much less than Americans would like to buy on the market. So by keeping the price of their product high, U.S. sugar growers are able to compete in this market and earn fairly high profits. What they're willing to do is offer campaign contributions to policymakers in exchange for this sort of legislation that helps them out. So even though American consumers are made worse off overall, the sugar industry is made much better off overall. So they're going to be willing to band together and donate money to campaigns, to politicians, to encourage them to keep the sugar quotas in place. Whereas the consumers are going to face much lower cost. They're going to face a cost, but it's going to be a lot less than the individual sugar producers are, than what their gain is. So it's going to be very difficult for all of those consumers to get together to lobby the government to try to get the sugar quotas taken away. So what we end up with is these laws that support a small group of people that make them better off at the expense of a large group of people. In the Federalist Papers, James Madison worried about the tyranny of the majority, and a lot of the U.S. Constitution was designed to prevent a large group of the country from taking advantage of a small group, small minority within the country. Ironically, this is like the tyranny of the minority, where a small group of people are able to enact laws that make them better off at the expense of a large group of people. And in the logic of collective action, Mansour Olson explained the process by which this happens. So U.S. sugar firms, they have a large per person gain from enacting this sugar quota. So it's very easy for them to get together and to lobby, and they're willing to spend each a large sum of money because they're getting so much money, the benefit um, from the sugar quota. On the other hand, it's very difficult to get a large group of consumers together. Anytime you get a large group of people together, it's very difficult, very expensive to coordinate. Also, each person is only paying, maybe I think for each family it's like $100 to $200 a year that the sugar quotas cost them. So it's a small per person cost. So it's very difficult to get a large group of people with a small per person cost together. But it's very easy to get a small group of people with a large per person benefit together. So this is why we see these regulations, these laws designed specifically for small groups that make small groups better off at the expense of everyone else. Next idea is log rolling and rational ignorance. So log rolling is when one politician gets support for their bill by promising to support the bill of another one of their colleagues. So this is another reason why sugar quotas continue to exist, even when they benefit relatively few people. That a politician wants to get, they have a certain legislation that they want passed, they'll agree to support someone else's bill. So they'll agree to support the sugar quota as long as that other politician who's sponsoring the sugar quota agrees to support their bill. So they end up trading votes. That's how a lot of bills end up getting passed or getting increased support. Now, why wouldn't voters just vote out of office people who support such inefficient policies and policies that are going to cost them money? Even though it's not a large sum, U.S. families still end up paying more every month for products that involve sugar. So it's adding to their grocery bills. Did you think they would not support any politician who would support that? But because most policies hurt individuals so little, they don't actually know the cost of these. And it's too expensive and too time consuming to keep up with it. It's just not worth it. Have you ever heard someone say it's not worth it to follow the news or it's not worth it to get involved in politics? This is exactly why. Because it's going to be very difficult for your vote to change the outcome of an election. So because of that, if you're an individual, if you're trying to make the best use of your time, odds are getting well informed about what's going on in the world isn't going to help you out because you're not going to be able to do anything with that knowledge. So we call this rational ignorance, that voters are ignorant about what's going on in their government, not because they're bad people, not because they're careless, because it's not worth it to sit down and do the actual research. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, that's not me, like I know so much and I keep up with this, think to yourself, name your local representative. Name the member of Congress from your district. What district are you actually in? Name both of the senators from your state. Name the governor and the assistant governor. See, there's all these different politicians that is very time consuming to keep track of. And no, I'm not trying to be a sarcastic asshole right now. I don't know who half of those people are for me. Again, because so often it's the amount of time you have to put in to learn this stuff isn't worth it. I could be doing something for my career that actually makes me money, or I could be doing something fun with friends and get some enjoyment out of it. Is regulatory capture. So in principle, we have these regulatory agencies that are the watchdogs for consumers, and they're there to help make voters better off. So like the FDA, their job is to safeguard consumers from low-quality pharmaceuticals. But there's a problem. Firms that are significantly affected by these regulatory agencies have an incentive to make sure these agencies are, on their side, that the regulations aren't going to be too onerous for them and too difficult for them to comply with. So we say that regulatory capture occurs when an agency, a regulator, is acting more in the interest of firms that it's supposed to regulate than in the public in general. Now, one reason this is true is because, firms will be willing to spend money on politicians who nominate some of the heads. So they'll, donate them money and say, hey, like we want this former pharmaceutical executive to serve as a high level in the FDA. But there's another thing going on, and it's called the revolving door. So who's best suited to regulate an industry. Someone who's incredibly knowledgeable about the industry. That makes sense. If you want to regulate complex pharmaceuticals, you need pharmaceutical knowledge. If you want to regulate um, over-the-counter derivatives that are being sold to investors, you need to be involved in creating those derivatives at some point so you have the knowledge. So what we end up having is the FDA, these regulators have to hire individuals that were from the industry that they're regulating. So obviously they're going to have some affinity towards the firms that they're supposed to be regulating. And not just that, like I said, there's the revolving door. So not just are they going from industry to the regulators, afterwards they end up going back from being a regulator to the industry. And each time they go from industry to being a regulator to back to industry, maybe back to being a regulator, they get promoted up each time they're, hired to a higher level within each. If this sounds like a conspiracy theory, it's not. When I was in grad school in DC, this was a career path for a lot of people, and it was advised to us to look into this. You go, you work for a regulator for a while, so you work doing something for financial services, then you leave financial regulator, you go work for a bank for a while. When I applied for a job at the Federal Reserve, um, which was overseeing banking portfolios to make sure that they were well capitalized against risk, one of the things they said is after this job for 3 years, most of our people go work for banks. So we encourage you to go work for banks afterwards. So people in the know, this isn't just like a conspiracy theory. This is actually this is how it's done, and this is how you advance. And these people doing this aren't bad. They're not evil. It's just, this is the best career path for a lot of people. So another example from the past was the Interstate Commerce Commission. The purpose of this was to regulate railroads originally, not even trucking firms, just railroads, because each railroad had a monopoly on their route, so they could charge super high prices. So it was the Interstate Commerce Commission's job to encourage competition where it was possible and to make sure these railroad that they weren't taking advantage of the people that wanted to ride on the routes. What it ended up doing was preventing competition in the industry. So it was captured by the railroad companies, ended up supporting them. So what they did was they regulated trucking, made it very difficult or expensive to ship with trucks so that they could protect the railroad industry. So instead of actually protecting consumers like it was created to, and it ended up protecting the very industry it was supposed to regulate. As Voltaire once said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So let's dig into the nirvana fallacy. The nirvana fallacy is rejecting a realistic solution because it doesn't meet the standard of some imaginary perfect solution. So think of it this way. Seatbelts are good. Seatbelts save lives on average. But seatbelts could trap a person in a fire during a car crash. So if you would say, well, seatbelts shouldn't be worn because look at this, it could possibly make it worse. This is an example of the nirvana fallacy, where you're getting rid of something that's good, something that's helpful, because there's some more perfect solution out there. And there's some places where this might not hold true, it might not be perfect. Oftentimes, economists and policymakers commit the nirvana fallacy by comparing an imperfect market solution to a perfectly working government solution. So we're imagining this benevolent dictator. They're both omniscient and omnipotent. So they know everything and they know exactly what they want to do and they know exactly how to do it. The problem is that's not how government works in the real world. Just like there's people that lack knowledge, well, everyone lacks complete knowledge in a market setting, they also lack complete knowledge within the government. So they're, people just trying to do what's right, just trying to act in their own self-interest, whether they're in the market or in the government. So public choice can be seen as a rebuttal to the nirvana fallacy, that we're comparing realistic markets that fail in some ways and fail to live up to that perfect standard with government action and a realistic look at government that also fails to live up to the perfect ideal. So we compare the imperfect government and the imperfect market solution, and we try to determine which is going to be better. We look at the costs and the benefits as they are in the real world, not as we imagine them to be. So although people vote, do you think they invest a lot of time and energy into learning what they're voting on? If you've met a lot of people that vote, then you know the answer is no. And public choice theory would predict that people don't invest a lot of time and energy into this. Like I said, they're rationally ignorant. This is an old slide I used a couple years ago, asking who was Joe Biden. At the time, he was the former VP. And that was my one of the examples was, can you name like the former VP? When you go to the public, most of the public cannot. Look on the right side. There's a poll of people asking them what they knew about the government. Now, 94% of people polled knew that the president's term was 4 years. But as you go down the list, they know less and less. Only 28% could name one of their state senators. Only 30% knew that the House of Representatives, that their term was only 2 years. Less than 40% could name both of their U.S. senators. So why do so few people know about their senator, their representative, or their mayor? And how do they even square that with knowing how these people vote on road construction, on bank regulation, on farm subsidies? How do they know what policies these people support or don't support when they don't even know who they are? The average American spends more on taxes and regulation. Taxes and regulation cost them so much more than food, clothing, or transportation as a part of their budget. But they know so little about that, while they know so much more about the food they buy, the clothing they buy, the transportation they buy. So why is this the case? Why do people know so much less about government than they do about the products they buy in their own lives? Well, the reason is they capture all the benefit when they know about the products they buy. So think of it. If you go to the store and you're comparing food prices and quality between Safeway and Wegmans, you're the one who gets the benefit. You capture all of that by getting the better food or getting the same food at the lower price. That's all you. But if you're comparing Democrats to Republicans, you're looking at their different infrastructure bills or their different the way they approach banking regulation. You only get that benefit if your vote decides the entire election. If it's 50-50 and you're the tying-breaking vote. So you're only going to get a very, very small portion of the benefit back if you actually dig deep and try to understand not only what the policies those people, the politicians running support is, but what the actual effect is going to be. So it doesn't pay to be informed about politics. You get this immense cost, but you get a very small benefit from doing that. So most people are rational. They just don't know that much. Plus, there's the added benefit of having political parties that end up serving as a very simple way to say, oh, are they small government or big government? Are they conservative or are they liberal? So they give you some sort of idea as to what you're voting. So you don't have to put in very much time. So can democracy, or like our country, a representative democracy, work well when voters are ignorant? According to some social scientists, it doesn't matter that so many of the voters end up being ignorant about what's really going on. How can this be the case? So if the voters' errors are random, it's the fact that they don't know what's going on, they're rationally ignorant, so they're voting randomly, whether it's for or against their best interest. In total, they're going to cancel out. So the well-informed are going to end up being the votes that matter. So let's say, in this example, 90% of voters have no idea. They're completely rationally ignorant. They're just randomly voting between one of the two major candidates. And there's 10% of the candidates, or the voters, who do know exactly what the candidates' positions are and whether those positions are going to be good or bad. If the errors are random, if voters are wrong randomly, so they have just as likelihood of being wrong in one direction as they are being wrong in the other direction, their votes are going to cancel out. So those 90% don't matter. And it's the 10% who do matter, who do have this deep knowledge. Whichever candidate wins, that 10% is going to win the election. So whoever has the majority support of the well-informed is going to win. And we'd expect the well-informed to have, in this case, have the better selection, have the better vote. This is what we call the miracle of aggregation. When you aggregate up with all of the many rationally ignorant voters and the few voters that know what's going on, we can still come to the best outcome and select the better candidate. Now, the key assumption, which you may have noted when I mentioned on the last slide, is that the errors are not, or that the errors are random. That was the assumption. They may not be random around the truth. So people may not be randomly wrong. They may be wrong There may be something systemically making them all wrong towards the same direction. So rational ignorance, whether we can select the best outcome, it changes based on what information gets to voters and who within the whole pool of voters is informed versus uninformed, and whether these errors are systemic or if they're random. So real campaigns, when these are ran, they're based on a lot of hoopla. They're based on hype. They try to get people excited through rallies. They use a lot of symbols, and they focus on trivia that's not important or serious. It's not going to make people in the country better or worse off. So there's very little discussion of actual issues. You end up with parties trying to build brands for themselves, maybe things like family values, tough on defense, open to immigration, things like that, that really they end up not having concrete policies attached to them. And it's regardless of realities. So someone can say, oh, yeah, I'm tough on crime or I'm tough on immigration, but actually really not be, and vice versa. Additionally, the news media and the campaigns themselves try to entertain people. It's, they're competing for eyeballs, they're competing for people to actually show up. So you need to provide some excitement, some entertainment to get them willing to watch, get them willing to take part in these events. It shouldn't be any surprise that among young people, most of them get their political information from The Daily Show. Again, this is a show that's made to entertain, even though it's about the news. It's much of it's done in a joking manner, compared to the previously much more serious, now barely more serious cable news shows. So this may be a good thing, at least we're communicating some information. People are getting very vague ideas based on the brand developed by political parties or by the candidates that run under their banners. But it does change and bias who succeeds and who fails when we're looking at these elections. And because of this, the errors aren't going to be random. We expect errors to persist in certain directions. There's going to be some sort of bias to them. So we may not end up with the best result. We may not end up with the 10% of the population who's actually informed making the decision. So in practice, these errors that voters have, this ignorance is often systemic rather than just being random. So if you look at public opinion about the federal budget to the true numbers, you see they're often wrong in the same direction. You see that they often anticipate the budget or different components of the budget. They overestimate them consistently. So we see Americans, they overestimate the level of foreign aid and welfare spending. People think welfare spending is a large portion of the federal budget. In fact, it's a very minuscule part of the federal budget. Not to say there aren't problems with welfare, but the problems with welfare are not the size and the overall size of the spending. Likewise with foreign aid. Some people think if we cut foreign aid, we'll be able to pay down the national debt in a couple of years. But in fact, foreign aid is a very, very small portion. And we typically underestimate and consistently underestimate pension and health spending, which are huge parts of the federal budget. Because of this, American voters tend to be wrong consistently in the same direction. So we're not going to get these errors that cancel each other out. Instead, we're going to get the errors that compound upon each other. So we end up voting for candidates that make those things worse. And we don't get, the small sliver of voters that aren't ignorant deciding the election. We end up with the ignorant voters deciding the election. Returning to the sugar quota example. Here, the self-interest of politicians does not necessarily align with the social self-interest. And we get this problem because of the difference in who's informed and who's uninformed. So these errors aren't going to be random. So those who are harmed by the sugar bill, by the sugar quota, those are the rationally ignorant, the people that don't realize how harmful the sugar quota is for them. They maybe don't even realize that this policy exists. So they have very little incentive, very little reason to oppose this policy. But those who get the benefit from the sugar quota, those sugar producers, they're rationally informed, and they have a strong incentive to support this policy. So self-interested politician, just trying to get reelected, very likely to support this policy, even though it damages many people. That's because the people that actually hurts aren't the ones that are informed, they're uninformed. The secret to political success is concentrate benefits and diffuse cost. So if you concentrate benefits, that ensures that you're going to have special interest groups that are going to vote for you. They're going to give your campaign a lot of donations. They're going to be heavily informed about what's going on with your campaign and what you're supporting. But if you could spread those costs out across the entire public, they're not going to bother voting against you, getting organized, trying to spread the knowledge to get you out due to this rational ignorance, and they or due to the cost of actually organizing people, and they may not even know about it because of the rational ignorance, because of the cost and the amount of time and effort it's going to take them to learn about this policy that you supported, and then it's actually bad for them. That's why we see the sugar quota persist. Why we see tariffs that support one industry, so it may support automakers, or may support the steel industry, whatever industry is being protected by those tariffs, while it costs all consumers throughout the economy a lot more for their products. We end up with very progressive tax brackets where the more money you make, the higher your marginal income tax rates are. But we end up with tax loopholes that only support, or that primarily support, the very wealthy. Again, because they're able to lobby Congress, they're able to convince them to design these loopholes that support them. And that's why we see regulatory capture, which we talked about earlier. And again, rational ignorance is going to exist, and it's going to persist when the benefits of being informed are less than the costs of actually being informed. So voters are going to be rationally ignorant about politics. That's because the incentives to be informed are very low. The payoff you get from actually learning about what's going on is very small compared to the amount of time and energy and cost that it's going to take for you to actually learn about these things. Now, ignorance about political matters is important for three reasons. First of all, most obviously, ignorance makes it difficult to make informed choices. When you're missing this knowledge, it's very difficult to try to, act on it. But ignorance can lead to bad policy. If the public supports these candidates, not knowing that they, support things like the sugar quota, it ends up leading to bad policy. It ends up being much more costly for the country and everyone in the country. And another problem with ignorance about political matters is not everyone is rationally ignorant. Those that get the concentrated benefits, they're not going to be ignorant. So they're going to be able to lobby politicians and try to convince politicians to keep those policies in place that actually benefit them at the expense of everyone else. Now, we all like to tell ourselves that we're good people, that we're this or that we're that we're good at something, or that we're willing to go the extra mile to help someone. But those stories aren't often reality, and our stated preferences of wanting to be good people often bump up against the observed reality and what we actually do. For example, we may want to say, oh, we're very charitable, we would love to help people out, we want to take care of people. But in reality, we end up not spending very much time or money on charity. In a market setting where we bear the full cost, we often do very little. But in politics, through the political process, we can often remove much of the cost of expressing these ideas about ourselves. So again, going back to charity, we may not spend a lot of time or money doing charity ourselves. We may not donate a lot of money to food kitchens, or food pantries or soup kitchens. We may not actually volunteer to work at those and give out food to people because of how costly it is in our own lives, how little time we have. Now we feel we don't have much extra money. But when it comes to politics, we may be more than willing to vote for, more spending on SNAP and other types of welfare programs that helps people get food. That's because the cost of doing that is very low to ourselves. It should make sense. The quantity demanded of a good is going to increase the lower the price. Remember, very simple idea of the downward sloping demand curve. So we're more likely to be charitable when we're voting than when we're giving personal donations, because the cost of those charitable donations that we're voting for are much lower than when we actually pay them out of pocket. At first, this may seem like a good thing. This is great, we're going to vote for more charity than we would if we were actually spending the money ourselves. Oh yeah, this may be great for charity, but this is true for all things, for all types of goods. So even for something like stupidity, the cheaper we make being stupid or voting for something stupid, the more we're going to get of it. So let's suppose that Joe was really biased against Asians. Now, is Joe likely to express this bias, this dislike of Asian people, by not buying goods from Walmart when a lot of the goods that they sell in Walmart are produced in Asia and actually make, Asians better off? No, because this is a substantial cost to him to buy these more expensive goods elsewhere. But If Joe's asked to vote on restrictions on immigration from Asia, another way, Asians can make themselves better off by coming to the United States, he's more likely to vote on these restrictions because he's not facing a cost of this. So while this idea that voting because it lowers the cost of these things, because it's spread out across so many other people, um, we think it's good, it also lets us do a lot of bad things more than we would in our own personal lives because of the cost of voting for something much lower than the cost of doing it in our own lives. So let's continue with this example of Joe, who's biased against Asians. So his bias doesn't cause him to stay away from Walmart. Remember, because that'll be personally costly for him, making this decision in the market. But it isn't costly for him, so he will be more than willing to vote for immigration restrictions, even though these lower immigration restrictions may end up being very costly to the economy overall. It's not as personally costly to him as it would be foregoing Asian-made goods at Walmart. So let's say Joe doesn't just have this bias, it's also mixed with a belief that immigration lowers wages, a fact that's potentially true and can actually be tested. Now, if there were studies that came out showing that immigration doesn't reduce wages for native-born citizens, can we use this to convince Joe? Will this change his opinion on immigration policy? In effect, it's not going to do that. And Joe has no reason to actually be convinced and to weigh this evidence because it's being mixed with this personal feeling of this dislike of Asians. And it's going to take away his comfortable belief. So he'd be unwilling to actually give that information a fair hearing and actually weigh it, how good this evidence is versus his previous beliefs. So we end up with this failure to learn because we've mixed these personal beliefs with true and testable facts. So Joe can have all different types of ideas about how the minimum wage helps the poor, how free trade is bad for economic growth, how Chinese immigrants can't be trusted, and how we need to ban Chinese immigrants or at least reduce their number, make it harder for them to come here. But why would he ever question, confront, or think carefully about these biases as they relate to politics? As long as these biases don't affect his personal decisions, then Joe can hold these biases at a very low cost. Remember, if he holds them in a market setting, it's going to be personally very costly to him. So he's not going to give up his, cheap foreign-made goods at Walmart. But he will be more than willing to vote against them because he's personally bearing a very small cost from that vote. Even though these can have very bad political outcomes, they're not particularly costly to him. Now, we all have biases. We may have a bias against foreigners or strangers, for example, and this is probably a natural inclination from evolutionary times that we're concerned about the next tribe over coming over and stealing what little food we've hunted and gathered. And in many ways, civilization over time overcomes these biases, and we've seen this over the past couple centuries. But personally, we're not likely to overcome these types of biases if the prices of holding these biases are low. So look at the market setting where you have these biases against Asians for Joe in our example. Market setting, buying from Walmart is personally costly, but for voting it's not very costly. So Joe in our example, very unlikely to learn and to overcome these biases. So in the market, we typically get to choose goods one at a time. So we determine if each one is good for us, if we think it's beneficial relative to the cost. We make a decision whether we want to purchase it or not. In politics, we don't. We tend to have two parties running, and the candidates in those two parties, they have different policy prescriptions. And you get to choose which bundle you like more. But you have to choose. You can't pick and choose within that bundle. You have to choose all of one or all of the other. So in a market setting, what would happen to consumer satisfaction, to cost, efficiency, all these things, if our only choice at a grocery store was, in this example, bundle D or bundle R? So you have to choose which of those better meets your needs, but you can't choose individual things within that actually meet your needs. So let's say in this example that people vote and bundle D wins, so everyone that goes to the grocery store has to purchase bundle D. Can we say that this means that consumers prefer eggs to bologna, since you have eggs in the winning bundle and bologna in the losing bundle? Of course not. There's a lot of uncertainty whether a majority of individuals actually like the products, like particular products within each, or whether they just prefer the overall bundle to each. So maybe people really, really like eggs, and that's why bundle D won, and they don't really like much else in there. But in the other bundle, they slightly prefer bologna, the bread, the orange, the apple, a lot of other things in there. Very difficult for us to understand. And it's very difficult for the store itself to try to figure out what to sell because they don't know what it is in Bundle D that made it better than Bundle R. They just know something in there made it better. Individuals that own property take into account the future value of the property. So they're not just worried about the value in the short term, they have to be worried about how other individuals would value that property, whether they'd be willing to purchase it or not. And these things make people take a more long-term view of their assets. So private investors are going to think about the future costs and benefits when they're making an investment decision today. Now, is this true about politicians? A politician is likely to be myopic, to focus overwhelmingly in the short run at the expense of the future ignored cost. Now, why is this the case? A politician can't sell their office. They can't keep it for a long time, and they can't develop that asset to make it more valuable. So a politician needs to be reelected, and typically the reelections are very short. 2 years in the House of Representatives, 6 years in the Senate, 4 years for the president. So a politician needs to focus on benefits that the voters are going to see now. They need to be able to prove that they're doing something before the next election day. They can't just say, yes, my policies are going to pay off in 20 to 30 years. They have to say, I've done this for you and look how much better it's made your lives. Hell, in presidential debates, in those political commercials you see on TV all the time, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Common thing we see, common theme running through those commercials, sometimes very explicitly stated, is your life better off now than it was? So politicians need to focus on these short-term benefits, but they end up not looking at the long-term cost because it's not going to be their problem. That's for someone else to worry about later. So often we'll see politicians kick the can down the road until the crisis hits. We could have reformed Social Security 20, 25, 30 years ago. They were debating that in Congress. But it made some hard decisions. We might have to increase taxes. We may have to lower the amount of benefits, the Social Security that old people get every month. We may have to increase the age that you can first receive Social Security. Those were all very unpopular, even though they needed to be done, 2-3 decades ago in order to make sure it was solvent. They didn't do that, and now we're going to run out of money within the next, 30 years. Often, they engage in deficit financing with either tax cuts or spending increases. So they'll run a deficit today, and they'll end up cutting taxes because, cutting taxes is popular. Letting people keep more of their money, very popular. But we end up having to use deficit financing. The government has to issue debt to end up paying for it. Rather than having a balanced budget, we run a debt because it's easier. You get the immediate benefit of these services, only at the long-term cost of increased national debt. You end up with political business cycles or inflation in order to juice the economy before an election. It makes sense to try to lower the unemployment rate as much as possible if you're the president right before an election. Richard Nixon famously pressured the hell out of the Federal Reserve Chair to do this in the lead up to his election because he wanted the benefit of low unemployment and said he'd worry about the inflation later. And finally, you have things like rent controls. There's very long-term negative side effects of rent controls that we already talked about in class earlier on. But in the short term, voters really like rent control. They like knowing that they're going to save money on rent. So a politician will do something with very negative long-term costs for that immediate gratification so they can get those votes in the next election. And it's not that politicians are evil, that they're particularly short-sighted people. It's that these are the incentives set up by the institutions. Elections every 2 years means that you need immediate results from something, and you need to do something that people like. The fact that you won't be there to bear the cost in 20, 30 years means that you're not going to be considering those costs. This is only natural, and we should expect it to continue because of the way we've designed government and the way government works. Also, politicians spend other people's money. They don't spend their own. So they don't take into account the cost as much as they would if you were spending your own money. And it makes sense. If you're going to a restaurant tonight to get something for dinner, odds are you're going to spend a small amount of money as possible to get, a decent meal. You're not going to go crazy. But if your parents take you out and say they're paying for dinner, odds are you're gonna order a much larger meal, much more expensive meal than you would if you're paying for it yourself. And it's the same basic idea here. When you're working with other people's money, you're far less concerned about cost. So we end up politicians spending more money because it makes voters better off. So we encourage to spend more than they would if they were bearing the full cost. And the cost is going to be spread out across all voters. So we get this tendency to overspend. Turn to bureaucracy. The actual civil employees, that their job is to implement and carry out the laws and the regulations passed by Congress. So the larger a bureaucracy is, the more opportunities there are for promotion within it. So as the government agency or commission or department, whatever, as they expand, so does their power, the prestige, and the salary of the typical bureaucrats that are working for that agency. So we can imagine these bureaucracies as budget maximizers, that each bureaucracy, each agency is trying to make their budget as large as possible. And this is consistent with honest bureaucrats who truly believe in their mission and think what they're doing will help the country. In fact, if you think what you're doing is going to help the country and will make people better off, then of course you're going to try to get a larger budget each and every year because you think having a large budget is a good thing. So it's not inconsistent with decent people trying to do what's best for the country. And I don't want you to think that I'm shitting on them saying these are evil people doing it. I'm talking about the incentives that they're facing within these organizations. But politicians have some incentives to rein in bureaucracies, to control them, but it's very difficult to do because there's no profit or loss calculations. So we don't have these signals. Remember, profit and losses were both signals and incentives that showed what a firm is doing is helping people, is meeting their needs if they earn a profit, or if they earn a loss, it's a sign that what they're providing to consumers isn't worth the cost of putting it together. So they have to do it more cheaply, or they have to use those resources to produce something that consumers actually want. Bureaucracies don't have these profit and loss signals and incentives. So when politicians are trying to make decisions of what to do, the bureaucracies tend to be major sources of information. And we see a lot of government agencies have major sections that deal with just gathering data and producing reports to help politicians reach these decisions. So bureaucracies are encouraged and they tend to expand their reach over time. They start out with a small, narrow area that they're supposed to focus on, and over time it grows to larger and larger areas. Now, promotion within bureaucracies are caused by regulation and by solving these problems. So what they're encouraged to do is try to design new regulations, find new areas to regulate, develop new regulations, rather than trying to find the optimal amount, or rather than trying to get rid of regulations. So we should expect regulation to accumulate over time, which is what we see. Like I mentioned, capitalist businesses, they make their decision based on profit. Bureaucracies, they have no profit and loss signal. They're unable to use that to try to determine what decisions to make or how to go about implementing their decisions. So what they do is they craft these rules and they have very strict procedures. So what their goal is to do is they follow the rules to the best of their ability to treat everyone the same, and so that everywhere across the country, no matter who you are, if you deal with a federal agency, you have the same process to go through. Whereas a firm, they have profit to tell them if their decisions are right, so they can give lower level people more flexibility to make these decisions. Because bureaus don't have this profit and loss, they aren't able to get immediate feedback on their decisions. So they keep a very strict code of what each person is supposed to do, what their responsibilities are, and how to react in certain situations. Ludwig von Mises called the Catholic Church the world's greatest bureaucracy. No matter where you go in the world, you walk into a Catholic church, the Mass is going to be exactly the same. There's a very strict hierarchical structure, and everyone within the hierarchy has different responsibilities and are able to promulgate different rules. And when there's a rule issued by someone on one level, everyone on the level underneath them has to abide by that. And these rules are static. They don't change over time. They keep them the same as long as possible. So you see Catholic doctrine, the structure of the Mass, all these different things staying the same for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, bureaucracies also have an incentive to exhaust their budget and to seek budget increases. Now, imagine the budget is a profit of a firm. The best example I can think of from anything like pop culture is the episode of The Office where they have the surplus the branch does in their budget, and Michael has to decide how to spend it. Because, as Oscar tells him, if they think it only costs a certain amount of money to run the branch because you saved money this year, they're going to give us less money next year to run the branch. So it was his job to spend it at the last second. He had to decide between the new copier and the chairs, turned into a huge fight. He ended up keeping the money and buying the fur coat because recognizing that there was this incentive for the branches to keep to spend everything on their budget rather than give it back. They had the thing where they would give the branch manager, I think, 10% of whatever the budget surplus was, trying to incentivize them to save money. We don't see this with bureaus. If you don't use it, you lose it. The next year you have a smaller budget. So they end up exhausting their budget at the end of the year. Another one was Archer at the end of season, I want to say 6. Or maybe it was Archer Vice, where they were down overthrowing. They were involved in some rebellion, like overthrowing the dictatorship of the country. And the guy from the CIA, they asked the guy from the CIA who's down there overseeing the coup attempt, why are you doing this? And he says, oh, this is like an end of the year budget thing, so we didn't lose the money. Same basic idea. They're going to spend the money that they have to make sure that they have the same size budget the next year. So they're not encouraged at all to save money and to try to do the lowest cost possible. In fact, they're encouraged to spend more and to waste money. So you have firms, because of the profit motive, they're encouraged to limit their expenditures as much as possible, to do so in the most efficient way possible. You don't get that with bureaus. And also, they're biased towards observable outputs. It's difficult to say in a report that, yes, we're doing this, we're maintaining this, but you build a new bridge, this output is very easy to see that you're doing a good job. And if you say, I've started these 3 new initiatives, sounds much more impressive than I continued working on these 3 initiatives. So what we end up seeing is every politician in every election talks about our crumbling infrastructure. Well, what we end up doing, we spend a lot of money on infrastructure every year. But what we end up doing is doing things like building new bridges rather than maintaining those bridges. Because every politician loves a ribbon cutting ceremony on a new bridge. But no politician is going to get any press from maintaining an existing bridge.